14 December 1945. Munich. A 36-year-old clerk named Carl M. takes a stub pencil to a torn envelope and writes, "I helped with my vote, and now I must build it back with my hands." He would not have said that aloud. Not to the Americans. Not to the man in his building who had been party blocklighter. Not even to his wife. It was a line for a private archive. A sentence that summarized a story of ballots and bricks, of food and guilt and silence measured out by the kilogram and the page. He had stood in line in 1932 and again in March 1933. He had been 23 then. He had work in a warehouse, a sick mother, a memory of inflation and men selling furniture for bread. He put his mark next to a promise: work and order. The mathematics of desperation, one vote multiplied by millions equals a regime. Munich in December 1945 was a census of wreckage. The city's official survey, filed with the Office of Military Government, United States, Mungus, listed 50% of the housing stock damaged or destroyed. The report, signed by a weary civil engineer whose name would be found decades later in the Bundesarchiv, estimated 90 million cubic meters of debris across Bavaria, much of it here in the capital of what the old regime had called its movement. The rubble had its own vocabulary. Bricks with mortar that could be chipped off and reused. Reinforcing rods bent back with hammers, the curves like ribs in a chest cavity. The ground floor of a building open to the sky like a stage set. Rooms cut in half to the eye. Trümmerfrauen worked in lines and piles. Women in headscarves and men with missing fingers formed human chains to pass brick and splinter. Photographs in the Stadtarchiv München show them pooling sweat and cigarettes, a currency of the new arithmetic. They were the first labor that mattered, the first reconstruction that could be seen. Karl watched them and thought of sums. He had a ration card. He had a wife, Lotte, and a little boy, Peter, born in 1942. He had a mother he had been too late to bury who died in the winter of 1944 while the sirens were still an hourly drum. The arithmetic of his household was printed on paper slips, Brotkart, Fettkart, Fleischkart, calorie tables that classified bodies like machines. The Allied occupation authorities measured intake, 1,000 to 1,500 calories per day by the winter of 1946-47, less in some weeks, the British noting subsistence levels in their region, the Americans warning Washington in an intelligence summary that the population's patience was a function of the stomach. He wrote his line because he had lost his old job. He had worked as a junior bookkeeper for a wholesale firm that supplied office supplies to ministries. In 1937, he joined the party to secure promotion. He paid dues. He marched once, reluctantly, Lotte remembered later, because the boss was watching. His file would show the membership number, lower than some, a number that mattered later. After May 1945, after the white flags and the desperate journeys back from the East began to pass through, he was a man with the wrong membership and the wrong face in a time of questionnaires. The Americans entered Munich on 30 April 1945 with tanks that in Karl's memory were too large to fit the streets. A military government building took over a former Nazi administrative office near the Königsplatz. The curfew was printed in German and English and posted at the corners of ruined blocks. 2,000 Trive to 0500. Any assembly of more than 3 persons discouraged. Surrender illegal firearms. Inform on Nazis. Don't move. Don't run. Men and women were terrified. They had been told in broadcasts that Allied soldiers would rape, loot, retaliate for what had been done in their name. In the American zone, the fear moderated quickly. US officers were under orders to be firm, not brutal. There were still deaths. There were rough beatings. A rumor about a lynching in a village near Dachau spread like oil and proved unverifiable. But most enforcement came as grey forms and cold interviews. On 15 May 1945, OMGUS issued a denazification directive for Bavaria. Every adult filled out a Fragebogen, a questionnaire of more than 100 items. The document asked for everything: party membership, donor lists, clubs, rank, if any, positions, the names of superiors, the fate of Jewish neighbors. The bureaucratic voice was clinical. The questions stacked guilt into checkboxes. The system was not about vengeance. It was about arithmetic. There were too many. OMGUS records indicate that by the end of 1946, 5.4 million questionnaires had been distributed in the American zone, 3.6 million processed. The Sprüchkammern, the denazification tribunals staffed by Germans under Allied oversight, had categories: I major offenders, Hauptschuldig, I-offenders, belastet, 3 lesser offenders, Minderbelastet, 3 lesser offenders, Minderbelastet, IV exonerated, Entlastet. The mathematics of guilt reduced lives to Category I and II meant prison or internment. 3 could mean fines and restrictions. IV was the category of mass. V was the category of denial, absolution by paperwork. Karl attended his hearing on 21 October 1946 in a wooden hall that had once been a school gymnasium. His Sprüchkammer file survives in the Stadtarchiv München. It has a photograph clipped from a passport and a thin stack of affidavits. A co-worker signed a Persilschein, a whitewashing certificate that bleached the past with a neighbor's words. Ein ordentlicher Mann, the co-worker wrote, an orderly man. Nie politisch auffällig, never politically conspicuous. A letter from Lotte's cousin who had been in the police said the same. Karl said he had joined for the job. He said, "We all did what was expected." He said, "We all did what was expected." He said nothing about the vote in 1932. He said nothing about the boycott in 1933. The shop windows painted with words he remembered but did not repeat. The Sprüchkammer assessed him a Category 4, a follower. He received a fine. He was dismissed from administrative roles in public service and barred from managerial posts for 2 years. This is how he became a bricklayer. The city needed hands. There were no office jobs for men like him. There were bricks. The rubble was a quarry, and old walls were warehouses of the future. The cold mathematics of labor assigned people to salvage crews and building companies. The city's Bauamt had lists, and the lists were not clean. Ex-Nazis whose expertise was needed were quietly hired. Political reliability was balanced against competence. Stability was an equation solved with compromises. It is important to see the landscape. In November 1945, a photograph taken by a corporal with the Signal Corps shows Frauenkirche's towers rising above fields of ash. In the foreground, a woman walks with a bundle on her back, a toddler clinging to her coat. A hole where a wall should be frames a sky that looks larger than it should. Pigeons return to 4 people. The wind moves papers in rooms without ceilings. The air smells like creosote and wet brick. Karl's son Peter remembered his father's hands. In an oral history recorded in 1988 at the Münchner Stadtmuseum, he said he had white-collar hands until 1945. After 1946, they were rough. A photograph shows Karl holding a trowel, his thumb thickened. He had learned the angles of mortar and the weight of brick. He had learned how to stand with a straight back for hours on a wall. He had learned to work while hungry and pretend he was not. Hunger marked the years as surely as any calendar. The winter of 1946-47 was catalogued later as the Hunger Winter. Unheated rooms, dead pipes, frozen potatoes, insufficient coal. A British occupation report for January 1947 notes that the daily average intake in Munich had dropped to 1,050 calories. It was a crude composite number. It did not include what people could find on the black market or hamster trips to the countryside, where townspeople bartered bed linens and watches for eggs and sausage, cabbage boiled until it yielded to the spoon, rapeseed oil, dried peas thickened until they cooled into a cuttable slab. The mathematics of food were relentless. Calories into labor, labor into calorie tickets. Cigarettes became a unit of account. The American was the best brand. A carton could buy a coat. One cigarette could buy 2 eggs. This was the black market's arithmetic, a table found in a 1946 police report on illicit trade around Munich's main station. The report described the open-air stealth of it, hands under newspapers, a cough as a signal, a corner turned. Men in clean coats meet men with hard eyes, the report said. It was written by a former detective whose wartime duties are not listed. The city introduced Wirtschaftswunder, the management of living space. Inspectors with clipboards and no pity counted rooms and people. A family might be assigned a second family, 2 in a room. Children behind screens. An old closet converted to a sleep nook. The arithmetic of rooms was cruelly simple. Destroyed apartments divided by surviving families plus the wave of arrivals. Between 1945 and 1950, some 12 million Germans were expelled from territories east of the new borders, Silesia, East Prussia, Pomerania, the Sudetenland. The last treks, the slow columns of carts and feet, arrived in Bavaria with rusty samovars and children who looked their age and 10 years older at once. They were called Flüchtlinge, expellees by policy and fact. They represented a displacement measured in train timetables and headcounts. Munich registered them and tried to sort them into rooms. The locals resented them, then pitied them, then resented them again. A note in a Kreisverwaltung file in 1946 reads, 3 apply for the same room. Widow from Breslau, soldier's wife from Freising, family from Königsberg with 3 children. Allocate to the family. There was always a reason and never enough. A man from the Sudetenland hung his boiled linen to dry and watched as a neighbor stole it with a practiced gesture. He swore. She shrugged. They are statistics and they are also names. Martha and Otto R., registered on 9 September 1946, assigned a half-room at 23 Luisenstrasse, east-facing, cold in winter. They brought a saucepan and a fixed manner of speaking. They did not know who had died in their village. They did not ask. Karl worked with a man named Joseph, who had lost 2 toes at the front and had learned to use his left foot as if nothing had changed. Joseph was a different sort of story. He had not voted the same way in 1932. He had joined a Catholic workers' club, had fought the brown shirts in alleys and lost. He came home in 1943 without his toes and with a hatred that did not know where to go. He called Karl a Mitläufer, a follower. He also shared his bread with him when the lunch bucket seemed light. This was the arithmetic of crews: those who could not, those who could not, those who would be honest later, and those who never would. The city's workers were Instandsetzer, repairers. They knocked off mortar with the blunt end of the hammer and stacked reusable bricks in rows. They sorted wood. They shoveled rubble into carts. Photographs in November and December capture them in wool hats and coats too thin for the frost. The iron guts of buildings, boilers and pipes lay exposed like organs. They worked around them and with them, improvising. On 7 January 1946, the Americans forced the screening of a film. The title was Die Todesmillen, Death Mills. It was directed by Billy Wilder and assembled from the footage taken when Allied troops opened the camps. It was shown in Munich at a hall requisitioned for that purpose. Attendance was mandatory for those on lists compiled by local administrators. Carl went because the foreman read out the names, and it was a work day and lists had a weight that bodies obeyed. He stood in a room with 300 others and watched the projector throw images of bones and faces on a white sheet in a building that had once been used for community dances. He did not write about it. He did not speak about it. But he remembered certain frames, a bulldozer pushing bodies, children's shoes in piles. The word Dachau without a caption, just an image of a gate. He had lived 20 kilometers away for 12 years and had known and known and known again. This is the mathematics of denial knowledge seen, knowledge filed away, knowledge resurfacing under pressure like a spring. Contact with victims was not only on celluloid. The displaced persons' camps were minutes from Munich. Feldafing and Landsberg were made into islands of a different Germany. Fehrenwald, near Wirtschaftswunder, became a Jewish DP camp in October 1945, and it lasted until 1957. A United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration non-array officer named Judith K. Ho wrote in a field report from January 1946, "The routine is life-affirming, schools, theater, marriages. Many train for emigration for Palestine, tensions high with the local population. There were translators with perfect Munich accents and survivors with numbers on their arms. There were exhumations and reburials. There were trains where men and women stood in silence and stared at the floor rather than into eyes." In a letter preserved in the Bundesarchiv, a farmer from outside Dachau wrote to a cousin in March 1946, "They walked past our house. They looked through us. I gave a woman milk. She cried. I have no words." The line can be read as performance, as guilt, as kindness. It was all of these. Carl encountered a Jewish DP directly once, maybe twice. Once at a work site in June 1946. The Americans had requisitioned lumber for the camp, and a truck with 2 soldiers and a man in a grey coat arrived. The man's German was pure. He asked for signatures, and he asked them without anger. He watched the German's eyes. "Here," he said, pointing to a line. Carl signed. He went home and said nothing. Thomas Mann's words, printed in Die Neue Zeitung, the American-sponsored paper, called for a different Germany. The paper distributed in tens of thousands of copies ran photographs, essays on democracy, a serialized Dickens. It printed the news of Nuremberg. The International Military Tribunal began on 20 November 1945. The official stenographic record would fill dozens of volumes. The newspapers summarized the charges and printed the faces of men Carl recognized from newsreels and posters. He read the reports and felt the cold grammatical construction of it. The defendants knew, the defendants planned, the defendants ordered, and he put the paper down. Occupation reports show how the Americans tried to build something while punishing enough. The tension is present in every memorandum. They needed the railways to run, the water to flow, the coal to arrive. Railway engineers had been party members. Policemen had been party members. Judges had been party members. The mathematics of stability required that many be returned to their jobs. In 1947 and 1948, the tide of denazification receded. Sprüchkammern were closed or folded into administrative processes. Those in categories I and II remained. Those in IV and many in III got their papers and went back. The numbers in an OM-GUS cable from September 1947 show it, of millions investigated, a tiny fraction incarcerated. The system began to absorb the old into the new. It is not an exoneration. It is an accounting. Karl learned the rhythm of rebuilding. He learned to lay foundations according to measurements that promised a future. He worked on a school in Schwabing in 1948, where a plaque would later say, "Reopened to the children of Munich, 1950. He placed bricks that became shoulders of an arch that would host a door students would pass through. He did this because he needed to live, not because he sought to erase. He did this with quiet shame, not the performative sort, but a shame that one stores in the pockets like a piece of paper. On 20 June 1948, the new money arrived. Currency reform turned Reichsmarks into Deutsche Marks at ratios that were complex. The arithmetic of it is in every memoir. 100 Reichsmarks became 650 Deutsche Mark for cash holdings, wages and pensions converted differently. Prices were liberalized. The black market shrank. In photographs, store windows that had been empty for years filled with goods overnight, a phenomenon still argued about by economists and historians. There were always goods. There had been no incentive to show them. The money unlocked shelves. Cigarettes became less of a currency and more of a habit. Marshall Plan shipments began to arrive. Crates stenciled ERP, European Recovery Program, moved through Munich's yards. Dried milk, powdered eggs, machines with pale paint. The Americans invested, not from charity alone. The mathematics of the Cold War required a prosperous West Germany. It needed to be a showcase. It needed to be a bulwark. The Soviet Union had its zone. The border between zones was now a frontier. The arithmetic of ideology turned into an arithmetic of coal cars and tonnage. A photograph in the Bayerisches Wirtschaftsarchiv shows men with clean hats and tired faces opening crates. "Gift of the American people," the stamps read. There was propaganda posters with nice fonts and smiling workers. But there was also machinery. Karl watched cranes lift a lathe into a factory for a company he would recognize later when he walked past it in a suit. He realized then that he would never go back to ledgers and stools. He was a builder now. He joined a private company, Fuchs and Söhne Bauunternehmung, on 1 September 1949, hired at a daily wage posted on a board. The company's founder had survived the years by keeping low. The company had 2 trucks that were older than they looked, and 1 mixer that worked half the time. They won city contracts. They employed many men who looked like Karl and a few who did not. The payroll shows names with origins marked by initials, B for Breslau, KBG for Königsberg. Martha and Otto R.'s oldest son would later apprentice there. Munich was a sieve through which lives poured and then caught. Denazification had faded into a dull hum by 1950. There were still trials for crimes that could not be blurred. Dachau trials had been conducted by the Americans and concluded with sentences. Commutations came in the early 1950s. Names that had been shouted at rallies now appeared in court records. A former concentration camp guard lived under another name, 10 streets away. The papers tipped around it, printed fatigue in columns. The word Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with the past, did not yet exist in its later form. There were commemorations for the bombed. There were crosses for the dead. There was a statue of a mother holding a child in a square. There was no public monument yet to the Jewish neighbors who had vanished. That would come later. There were exceptions. A plaque here, a name there. But the early years of the new republic built a memory palace in which the largest rooms were filled with the suffering of those who remained. Karl sent Peter to school with a new satchel. The textbooks in 1952 had pictures of fields and factories. A chapter on 1933–1945 in a Bavarian schoolbook, printed in 1954, preserved in a teacher's archive, narrated the period with 12 pages on the war, 3 on racial persecutions, and 5 on the home front. It was not a lie. It was a distribution. The mathematics of attention measured what a generation could absorb. On 23 May 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was founded in Bonn. Dr. Konrad Adenauer was elected Chancellor in September. A photograph of him visiting Munich shows him in a hat at a slight angle, a statesman who spoke softly about morality and firmly about the new lines drawn across Europe. The Basic Law was printed and posted in schools. The Americans taught courses on democracy in evening classes. The churches produced handouts that linked conscience and citizenship. Political life resumed. Karl voted again, this time for the Christian Democrats. He did not tell Peter whom he had voted for in 1932. He did not write that down. The mathematics of guilt, of who went to prison and who went back to desks, filled gossip and records. Of the millions processed by denazification, only a fraction were jailed. A Munich civil servant, removed in 1946, was back at his desk in 1951 after the Article 1 law reinstated many ex-civil servants. He stamped papers and arranged housing for expellees with a literal straight face. A man who had worn an SS uniform was a foreman at a factory and kept his sleeve rolled down over a mark. A teacher who had taught race hygiene taught the periodic table. There were very few clean pages. This is not absolution, it is structure. The state required form, expertise, signatures. Those whose guilt was singular, those whose cruelty was not an accident of office, were in prison or had escaped to somewhere beyond names. Those whose complicity was the water in which they had swum were the water in which the new fish learned to breathe. The arithmetic of a society does not change in one column. The economy moved. It is tempting to tell the story as a miracle. But it was also a multiplication problem. Investment plus labor plus currency stability plus American security guarantee equals factories and wages. The term Wirtschaftswunder belonged first to headlines. It became a song on the radio. "Wir bauen auf," "We are building up." Karl hummed that while crossing scaffolds because the song had rhythm and he was, finally, earning more. By 1954, he had enough to buy a second-hand bicycle for Peter. By 1958, enough for a radio with a roll-top dial that found voices from Paris and Rome. The kitchen acquired an enamel pot that did not flake. On 1 May 1955, the Federal Republic entered NATO. Rearmament was a debate measured in public squares and long columns in conservative papers. The Own Mitch movement, Count Me Out, had marched in the early 1950s. They carried signs that said, "No more hats on rifles." It was a language of memory. We had had enough. Our sons will not wear what we wore. Adenauer promised that this time it would be different. Karl did not march. He had a job that required his arms in the morning and his legs in the afternoon, and his evenings were for rest. He did not like uniforms. He did not like the way he felt when he saw men in them. He watched them anyway. The Cold War brought its own arithmetic. The wall in Berlin went up in August 1961. Munich was far from it and intimately connected to it. Refugees continued to arrive until the wall sealed the passages. Student politics at the university argued in circles. The Americans stayed. Their bases felt permanent. The economies of the city became entangled in their presence. The wages paid to Germans on American bases were part of the ledger of growth. The presence of American music on the radio altered ears. The first rock and roll record Karl heard came through Peter's door, thin and bright. Karl worked on an estate in Hassenbergl in 1959. Rows of apartment buildings, Zeilenbau, stood like punctuation marks on the plain. Laundry dried across balconies. Children populated courtyards. Inside, walls were thin and clean. It looked like a plan, which it was. It looked like post-war modernity, which it was. He placed bricks that framed a window through which a woman saw her first television in 1963. He did not speak of 1932, but it was present in everything. It is in the line he wrote in 1945, because he understood the arc. He had believed propaganda the way a man looking through a fog believes the shape of a tree is a tower. He had wanted a job. He had tolerated a neighbor beaten on a street corner because he had already learned the discipline of gazes. Documentation was the tool and the trap. The Americans documented everything. The Germans documented everything. Bundesarchiv has the file of the Spruchkammer. The Staatarchiv has the housing lists, the ration registers, the black market police reports. OMGUS. Weekly intelligence summaries describe the mood in phrases like sullen and more cooperative than expected. The Bavarian Finance Ministry sent circulars on tax arrears that read like the minutes of a factory. The railways kept timetables when they hardly ran. The mathematics of paperwork tethered a society to itself. The human parts are in the diaries. A Trümmerfrau, Hilda W., wrote on the 3rd February 1946, "Today I found a child's shoe under a stone. The leather was still soft." She wrote this because she had to write something. On 7 March 1948 she wrote, "Care package. Coffee. I cried." A policeman, demoted in 1945 and reinstated in 1945, wrote in 1949, wrote in 1949, "It is good to have orders. I am not built for freedom." His name is redacted in the file. An ex-Belize boy wrote in a school composition in 1953, "Breslau was too far for us to go. My mother says we are here now." The composition was graded with a 2, a good note. There are numbers that stiffen the spine. On 30 October 1946, 19 men were hanged at Landsberg after U.S. military trials. Their names are in lists. On the first winter after the war, the number of Germans who died of hunger-related causes is estimated in the hundreds in Munich, thousands across the zones. The arithmetic of loss is both precise and misted by silence. Many deaths had more than one cause. Many lives had more than one identity. Memory became a profession later. In 1955, it was survival and growth. The last DP camp in Bavaria closed in 1957. Fehrenwald saw its last families leave for Israel, for America, for Canada. There was a ceremony for Canada. There was a ceremony. There were speeches that said, "Future, more than past." The German papers marked it as a problem resolved. The survivors had long memories that did not require German permission. The locals watched trucks roll and went on. Karl had a notebook by then. He wrote not every day, not in long sentences. He wrote tallies. In 1952, 100 bricks hour on good days. In 1953, new shoes for Peter. In 1956, paid the fine. The fine had been levied in 1946 when the Spruchkammer named him a follower and assigned a monetary penalty. He paid it in installments. The arithmetic of guilt turned into a monthly paper. He kept the receipts. He wrote 1 page about his mother. He wrote, "She died in winter. She was cold." He did not write about what he saw in the film in 1946, not directly. He wrote, in 1958, "We should have known. We did know." He crossed out the last 3 words. He wrote them again. Public life was full of official remembrance by then, but of a certain kind. Volkstrauertag ceremonies were solemn. They counted German dead. They did not name Jewish neighbors by slot. The Jewish community in Munich rebuilt slowly. A synagogue on Reichenbachstraße reopened in 1947. It stood quiet. There were ceremonies. The newspapers covered them in short columns. They were part of life and also a part. Many men who had voted like Karl did not end like Karl. Some became loud anti-communists and never acknowledged what their vote had done. Some retreated into clichés. Some drank instead of working. Karl worked. He did not join any post-war party committees or veterans groups. He did not wear pins. He wore work clothes. He showed Peter how to hold a line. The mathematics of justice are not satisfying. A pastor who had opposed the regime was honored. A judge who had sent men to prison for telling jokes about Hitler taught law. A poet who had published an ode to the Führer in 1937 wrote a poem about rubble in 1947 that won a prize. A woman who had hidden a child received no pension. The sums do not balance. They are not supposed to. History does not exist to make moral comfort. The quiet bargains of the new democracy were not written down as bargains. They could be read, however, in job appointments and school curricula and police unspoken rules about whom to watch and whom to leave alone. The heavy hand of the old state was replaced by a set of hands that, while new, had learned to move paper efficiently. The Americans did not try to control minds. They tried to build rails. The Germans learned to speak in a new tone, not always with a new heart. In 1964, Karl was invited to a ceremony. The city had rebuilt a square and placed a plaque on a wall that had an old bullet mark. The mayor spoke about lessons. People clapped. Karl stood with other builders and listened to a man who had been a minor party official in 1939 speak the language of democracy with such ease that it made the air seem lighter. He could not decide whether he was angry or glad. His son married in 1965. The wedding photograph shows Karl in a suit that was too tight at the collar and a face that had aged into its lines without surprise. The table had food. The arithmetic of that day was full of plus signs. On 14 December 1965, exactly 20 years after he wrote his first dangerous sentence, he opened the notebook again. He wrote a series of short lines as if he were filing an inspection report to himself. 1932. I voted. That was a hand. 1933, 1945. I worked. I looked. I said little. 1945. I learned. I shut up. 1946. I watched a film. 1946. I signed papers. 1946. They called me follower. That was true. 1948. They came back to their desks. 1955. We joined. We promised. 1961. They built a wall against us and them. 1965. I have made walls for shelter. I have not forgotten the walls for other things. He writes one more line. The front line now is inside, between what I remember and what I say. In another hand, later, perhaps Peter's, someone circled that line and wrote, "Do not erase." Munich in the late 1960s looks like a different place in photographs. New buildings with clean facades, cars gleaming, women in dresses of colors not available 10 years earlier, men in hats and, increasingly, without hats. A generation that had been born in the 1940s entering schools with teachers who felt old to them. The sports field that Karl had rebuilt now had grandchildren running on it. The square where the party had marched held a Christmas market where tourists bought butter cookies. Herzegovinian men and Italian men were now laying bricks beside men from Breslau and Munich. Gastarbeiter entered the arithmetic of the economy and the arithmetic of rooms. Karl's line about hands is not poetry. It is a mechanic's ledger entry turned into something like conscience. He did not atone publicly. He did not confess in front of others. He did not join a movement for memory. He built, and he read the newspapers, and he saved receipts. He kept the Spruchkammer paper in a drawer with a lock. He never told Peter what he had written in 1945 until he died. Then the notebook made sentences for him. A file in the Bundesarchiv contains an Allied intelligence summary from early 1946 that reports, Many Germans, not ideologically committed to National Socialism, believe themselves to have done nothing. It will be necessary to link passivity with responsibility without paralyzing them. It is a line rehearsed in memos and in the quiet of kitchens. It is a line that describes Karl. This story is recorded not officially, but in the logic of survival. There are receipts, there are photographs, there are lines in notebooks. There is the smell of mortar on the hands and the inversion of class that matched the inversion of politics. A clerk became a laborer. A man who had marked a ballot for a regime that built walls of hatred later built walls of brick. He was not alone. He was not singular. He was not singular. He was part of a curve on a graph and a fis in officially. He is of interest because the arithmetic of his life contains the fractions of a nation. Voted, belonged, benefited, looked away, was hungry, was judged, worked, saw, adjusted, became part of the majority that normalized the new state by the simple act of showing up for work. He did not write for a historian. He wrote for the pressure inside his chest, he wrote. And in writing he gave one sentence weight. Ich habe mit meiner Stimme zerstört und mit meinen Händen gebaut. I ruined with my vote, and I built with my hands. He wrote that sentence in December 1945, and then, 20 years later, wrote a line that holds it. The front line after 1945 ran through his memory.